Hello, thank you for joining us on Come Fund Me, the program where we speak with trans and non-binary people about their efforts to fund our expensive and complicated lives. Today, we have a very special guest, indeed, of the sort of different thrust. Please, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I am Alex Petrovnia. I am on Come From Me on behalf of my organization, which is the Transformations Project. The Transformations Project is dedicated to tracking and educating about the anti-trans legislative crisis going on in the United States currently. You or anybody else can go to transformationsproject.org and find out more about anti-trans legislation in your state and contact your representatives to make a difference.
Wonderful. So I want to back you up a little bit first and ask if you can tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your life outside of the Transformation Project.
Sure. So I'm the president of the Transformations Project. But in addition to that, and actually my day job is I'm an aquatic ecologist. I study aquatic invasive species and try to prevent them from spreading, which I find super interesting, but some people find very, very boring. It depends on the person for sure.
It sounds interesting.
Thanks. Basically what I do is I study fishermen and fisherwomen. We call them anglers. I study anglers and where anglers go and what kind of gear they use and the decisions that they make in order to evaluate their risk for spreading invasive species to different locations.
Interesting. That sounds like it could have a lot of really immediate effects on sort of the water tables in the area. Is where you were focusing. Is it really broad, or is this a nationwide thing, or is it more localized to where you are?
This is just in my state. I live in Pennsylvania, and so I'm doing it for the state of Pennsylvania only.
Just still probably covering a fair bit of ground.
Pennsylvania is fairly large. It's approximately like, I'm trying to think of something that's about the size of Pennsylvania and I'm coming up short. Anyway, it's fairly large.
Also, apart from Transformation Project, I know that you've got something of a presence in Twitter. Now we've touched on the sciences in your background, and I know that your Twitter is sort of focused on science and the history of science. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I have a pretty active Twitter presence and I do queer advocacy, queer history, and science history there. And try to educate people about particularly queer history, and particularly it's sort of blended with my work at Transformations Project and trying to draw attention to the anti-trans legislative crisis and all of the permutations of that. And I try to educate people about queer and trans history specifically, and especially the fact that queer and trans history is not new. Queer and trans people have always existed, and we have always made our impact known. We have always existed. We will always exist.
Yes, this is sort of quite often when I find myself, because they'll bring the arguments to you, right? Like you'll have your perfectly wonderful thread of trans affirmative or just living like just existing while being trans, and along
Sure.
comes some gender critic and wants to say that this is a diabolical regime that we've been brainwashed into that's only appeared since 2016 or what have you.
Yes, they try to make it seem that it's like a fad, which is a lot of why I spend a lot of time educating about queer and particularly trans history, and I try to educate about older examples of that particularly, and even allies I think can benefit from learning that, because I think the idea that trans identity is new or recent has seeped into a lot of people's psyches, whether they wanted it to or not.
Mm.
And I think that's an idea we can all do with fighting.
Yeah, it's sort of about delegitimizing, isn't it? It's just like in order to suggest that we're not legitimate in some other way. It's the crux of transphobia, isn't it? The existential doubt. Um, But what I think is interesting, there for me, that's a slam dunk. But they never catch that it's a slam dunk because then just say to them, it doesn't matter because you've already lost. You can piss in the wind all you like. We're gonna go on being born. You know.
Yeah, that is something I think is really important to keep in mind, particularly when things are dark for the trans community, is that trans people will always exist. We will continue to exist. It is literally impossible for our enemies to actually win this war on transgenderism that they've declared because we exist without their permission.
Definitely, this is what I tell them all the time. And I definitely agree. And it's the thing that gives me hope in all of this is to understand that as much as they can annoy and do harm, they cannot affect their goals ultimately because their ultimate goals are a fantasy. Um, so the transformation project. I mean, I think that anyone who's paying any kind of attention can appreciate the need for something like this. But just, to sort of set the groundwork, you are the founder of the Transformation Project. What was it that motivated you to do that?
Um, well, to be honest, it was really that I was in this Twitter space and I saw a bunch of trans people that I followed freaking out about these bills. And more, I realized that the cis people, well meaning as they were around me, had no idea that these were even happening. And more, as I looked into it, the legislative process is extremely opaque and is very difficult to muddle your way through. And as I realized that there aren't, one of these bills, there aren't two of these bills, there aren't a dozen of these bills, there are hundreds of these bills. And the more I searched, the more there was no good repository of all the information tracking these bills. That just didn't exist. Just could not believe that that didn't exist. And I thought, well, I have the internet, I have some of a presence. I can, give it a try to draw more attention to this. So it actually started with me explaining specific bills in plain language and actually tagging representatives on Twitter, because one of the things that Trumpism has done is that pretty much every American politician now has a Twitter, which is honestly an underutilized way to contact your local representatives, particularly.
And probably an
Um,
overutilized way to contact the most prominent politicians.
yeah, like I wouldn't recommend tagging Joe Biden because he's definitely not going to see that, but your local council person will definitely be checking their Twitter, or someone on their team will be checking their Twitter, and I guarantee that they will see that. So it started with me kind of tracking these as best as I could, and more people just kept asking, like, can I help? This is really cool what you're doing. And I started organizing those people, and it seems like overnight, organizing people became an organization. Uh, and we have been just expanding from there. Now we have about 125 volunteers that work with us regularly. We are an official 501c4 nonprofit. We have been since last fall. We have a fully updated database of all anti-trans bills in the United States. Uh, the bills explained in plain language, all the sponsors of the bills, all of the representatives to contact depending on where the bill is in the legislative process, information about where the bill is in its legislative process, and contact information for every representative we tell you to contact, all there in one place. So we're really about shortening the path to action as much as possible.
It's fantastic. That's really that sounds like a tremendous resource, especially in this fight that seems so well. I mean, it's gory, watching a map that you're used to seeing divided sort of roughly into two halves, a Democrat and a Republican, seeing this poison spread across those lines into states that I grew up thinking of as democratic states, the likes of, was it New Hampshire, Washington. So
Maryland, Rhode Island, Hawaii all
just
have bills
and that
currently.
it's really reminiscent of the fact that here in the UK there isn't a political party that hasn't been infiltrated by an anti-trans agenda. So it goes across whatever kind of a spectrum you want to call British politics. Not that there is, it's really a very right-leaning spectrum, although American politics, let's face it, is very right-leaning as well.
Similar issues there, yes.
But that is worrying to me, that cross partisan agreement on what should, by rights be an alt-right extremist viewpoint is worrying.
Absolutely.
Do you have any insight there from an American perspective?
Sure. A lot of what I try to impress to people in my work with the Transformations Project is to not get complacent, and really to, like you said, this is showing up in places that we often consider to be much more liberal. So this is showing up in places people might not expect. It's not just Texas and Florida. It's also, as we said, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Maryland, Michigan, Wisconsin, all of these places that we're seeing. I guess my major thing is that while the far right and the right in general has made trans people their bogeyman and has made them part of the culture war, the left is not standing up to protect us. It really is the right versus trans people ourselves, and we desperately need allies because we just don't have the numbers. Trans people just aren't that common. It's really true. The CDC estimates us at about 2% of the population. We can't do anything with those numbers without allies and without other people caring and stepping up to do something about this issue.
It's the age-old conundrum of a marginalized group, isn't it? Is exactly
Yes.
that. It's the tyranny of the masses versus the and not enough numbers to defend, forever in the tweets, like perennially answering to all the transphobes who say, why don't we just use our own toilets? Like, for Christ's sake, if you can drum up the funding to put in trans toilets everywhere, I'll happily use them every day. Go for it.
Honestly, that would be
You
way less
can-
anxiety inducing and probably way less
Seriously.
gross than a lot of the men's toilets I've been in.
Yeah, and I mean, I think an all trans toilet would be a really excellent place for conversations.
It would become a cultural hub, honestly.
It would probably become a tea for tea. How many love stories, and how many weddings would you be to where we met in the trans toilet
Oh my gosh.
we met at a trans toilet in Burger King.
It'd be adorable, honestly. I'm fine with that.
Me too. Well, back to the serious matter at hand. You've sort of touched on what people can do. Can you break down for us the kinds of, like, the areas of need that you have, and the kinds of resources that we are farming for, to make it nice and simple for the people at home to understand?
Yes, I am going to give people 3 different orgs that do different things in this crisis.
Okay.
So first of all, my org, the Transformations Project, educates about the crisis. You can go to transformationsproject.org, whether you live in a state that's considering anti-trans legislation or not, and contact your representatives to vocally support trans people and trans lives. And vocally oppose anti-trans legislation that may be in your state. You can find out at transformationsproject.org. Secondly, if you have resources that you are able to contribute, you can go to transfam.net, the Trans Family Network, which is an emergency resource network for people who are facing the consequences of these bills. So particularly right now, they are dealing with issues in Texas and in Florida as people are being impacted by legislation there. And the third one is a new org called Tear It Up. Tear It Up is organizing on the ground protests uh, for trans rights around the country. And if you can show up and be vocal and be an active participant and even just be a body that shows that you care, that means so much. And that will have such an impact in this fight. So those are the three different orgs that I can rep here that all have different ways for you to get involved and take action in this crisis. There is so much that any one person can do, whether it be contacting your reps, whether it be donating a couple dollars, whether it be just physically showing up at the location to say, I care about trans people and I care that this is happening. Those actions have so much more power than you realize. And particularly in this case, because most of these bills are state level bills. And the thing with state level bills is that the majority of people don't pay attention to what goes on in their state legislature. And so when you are contacting these representatives and when you are, showing up to these protests about state level bills, that's a lot more attention than these state level bills usually get. And the more
That's
we can make that attention be negative for these politicians' careers, if they're promoting these transphobic bills, the better it will be for the future. And the more likely politicians are to not consider bills like this in the future as well.
so there we are obviously going to end up reaching a trans audience, but we really need to get cis ears and eyes on these concepts and mobilize bodies, because what we're talking about is a numbers game at the end of the day. Am I right?
Yeah. And if you're thinking that, oh, it's a numbers game and, my reaching out won't make the difference, it really could. With these state legislatures, even 5 or 10 people reaching out to their representatives can make a huge difference because there just aren't that many people contacting them.
Okay, very good. So this is a call to action for if like so many of us are, hearing the news, you are distressed, disturbed, and want to be able to in some way contribute to opposing these things. Now you will have some means. We all have some means in our disposal down in the underneath bit, where I shall put such links, along with your Twitter, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, that's totally fine. You can come join me on Twitter and hear me yell about this all day, every day.
And learn about historical queers and historical science and historical queer science.
Yes, also that.
Very good. Well, thank you so very, very much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And
Thank you, Alex, for
again,
coming. This is inspiring what you're doing. It's all hands on deck this fight. For sure, for all of us. And so, it's really it motivates me to see how you dreamt of to fight against what you were seeing in your end. Thank you so much for coming, Alex.
yeah. One last thought to leave people is please go to transformationsproject.org to contact your legislators, your legislators in your legislature. To contact your legislators because it really does make the difference in this fight.